Hello. We are going to be presenting on the social psychology of disability by Dana S. Dunn, and we are going to be focusing on the overview, chapter 1. My name is Anthony.
My name is Eric.
And I'm Skylar. So in the beginning of the chapter, the definition for disability is provided, and it's some condition or characteristic that is linked to a particular individual and therefore is to some extent embodied. And disabilities can also be mental or physical, and it also surfaces different feelings such as curiosity, uncertainty, anxiety, and fear within people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And it is also causes people to not be sure how to act around those who do have disabilities. A disability is also present in everyday routine activities in someone's life. There is a clear difference between a disability, an impairment, and being handicapped. An impairment is used and refers to some disruption at the system level of a bodily organ, and a handicap is an obstacle imposed on people by the environment. So the definition of social psychology involves carefully considering how people think and feel about, influence, and relate to the actual imagined or presumed presence of other people. Although a disability is linked to a particular individual, it still has a very important social matter. People act differently in a classroom setting than they'll act when they go out to a party with their friends, so depending on the environment and situations, the way people's behavior changes. And then why does the social psychology of disability matter? It matters because social psychology of disability places an emphasis on the experiences of people with disabilities and how they view themselves, interact with other people with disabilities, and their relationships with people who don't have disabilities. Many observers of people with disabilities ignore environmental factors and focus solely on the qualities of the particular individual. So people with disabilities don't just have physical obstacles, they also face social obstacles as well, such as stereotypes being pushed on them by others. And the stereotypes are either very positive or very negative attributes that are highlighted about them. So Kurt Lewin came up with the person-environment relation, and that's how people perceive their environments affect both their subjective experiences and how they behave. And one of the things that plays into this is the actor-observer bias, where people with disabilities who are the actors tend to view situations in external qualities, so they tend to attribute stuff that happens to them towards the environment and other situations, while people who don't have disabilities are known as the observers, and they tend to view situations in terms of internal qualities. So they view situations that people with disabilities get in as being their fault and attributing everything to them as a person. And then also the fundamental attribution error is when the observer views the actor's qualities as more influential than the situation. So basically, qualities of a person with disabilities are more emphasized by those who don't have disabilities.
Alrighty. And with person-focused judgments typically occur when a behavior is identified as atypical. People with disabilities are typically defined as atypical, and the casual observer typically cites the person's behavior rather than the environmental constraints in order to make a judgment. Person-focused judgments can be alleviated if they observe the person in a different environment, such as a person in a wheelchair navigating their environment with relative ease. After that, any perceived difficulty will be seen as a limitation due to environmental constraints rather than lack of effort on the person's part. Then we have the WHO ICF model, which is the World Health Organization categorization of function, disability, and health model. This is a dynamic model that places disability on a continuum, which categorizes all levels of health and recognizes that each individual has a unique reaction and function at all levels of ability. This is a biopsychosocial model that takes into account all elements of the person's biology, physical environment, and social influences. This abides by the Lewinian environment-person relation. And this model is displayed here by this chart. It takes into account environmental factors, personal factors, participation activities, and bodily functions. Environmental factors can be anything from the environmental constraints to social structures that you're placed within. And personal factors are anything from lifestyle choices to any health-related conditions that affect you. Body functions and structures are simply just the psychological and physiological functions of your body. Activities are actually engaging within an activity, participating. And participation is your actual involvement within said activity. And you can see activity constraints due to physical disability, and you can also see participation constraints due to any perceived disability. And the ICF model replaces the traditional models, such as the moral model, which cites disability as a source of shame and something due to moral failing. And then we have the medical model, which is seen as a strictly biological model, but this ignores the environmental and social influences of disability. And then we have the minority social model, which cites disability as a social construct that subjects people with disability to different environmental discriminations, but this model isn't as dynamic as the ICF model. And one thing is person-to-person language. So essentialism is a major problem that highlights the disability over the person. And to avoid this, we use more empowering language and avoid monolithic terms. So rather than saying a diabetic, we say a person with diabetes. And rather than saying diabetics and lumping them all into one category and equating them to the disease, we acknowledge each unique individual as they are, so as not to devalue their experience and equate them to the disease. One caveat from disability culture is that people with disabilities may not always agree with person-first language. They feel that it is an attempt to separate the person from the disability because disability is seen to be something that is undesirable and unwanted and perhaps less than human. So many do not agree with this because they identify with their disability. So the best choice of action is simply to ask a person what they prefer to be called.
So within the framework of first-person language, person-focused judgments, Dunn outlines two kind of essential scales that can be used to consider when you're conversing with someone who has a disability. And as Eric said, it is imperative to ask them first how they prefer to be referred to, because that will produce the best results. But the first of these two scales is contribution. So for example, within the world of psychology, there's been a shift to refer to people who take part in experiments as participants, not subjects. That way, their active role in the event, the setting, is acknowledged, and that kind of thing can be drawn to other real-life situations with both outsiders, people without disabilities, and people with disabilities. And the second of these scales is sensitivity. As Eric said, someone who is diabetic might not want to be referred to as a diabetic. They might prefer to be called someone with diabetes. And the example that I included is essentially the same, except with the elderly. So someone might prefer to be called an elderly person as opposed to just dropping a label on them, calling them the elderly, as that can sometimes have a negative consequence because you're lumping them into a group that they might not feel that they are strongly a part of. And throughout considering contribution and sensitivity, it's important to choose your words wisely, as words that are chosen wisely can have a positive impact on the promotion of equality and inclusion of all people. So how does this relate to kind of a more macro level issue? Within the United States, about 56 million people have reported having some kind of disability, and the outcomes of this are quite grave and large, in that a lot of PWDs are highly underemployed and often can't find work, and the additive stress from lack of financial resources, lack of social support, can greatly add to the severity of their disability. So to close out the chapter, Dunn outlines some important constructs that she believes are important to understand, both as an outsider and as someone with a disability, to try and bring us all together and to avoid conflict between the two groups. These two couple together nicely. The first being that that the severity of a disability can be reduced or increased by the conditions of the environment. And this very much relates to Kurt Lewin's person-to-environment relation, in that the second point states that coping or adjusting to the disability is really quite dependent on how a person is able to understand and perceive the obstacles that they face, in that if you have a better understanding of your limits or your advantages given a physical or social environment, you are able to thrive better. Also, all PWDs, it's important to acknowledge that all PWDs also possess important personal and psychological qualities. And this is important to understand when thinking about how a person with a disability thinks about themselves, because they are greatly influenced by their self-perception and the given situations. So the outsiders have a great deal of impact on how this person views themselves if they are being talked about in a negative way or thought about in that kind of way. And lastly, perhaps the most important point, is that all people with disabilities deserve respect and encouragement. With the knowledge that we all will have or have had some kind of disability at some point in our lives, it's important to understand that it's not a separate issue. We are all one, and that to take these steps, to ask first, to think about these constructs and contribution and sensitivity, we can make a great impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.